Hey, Marcus. I'm John Rougeux. I'm an advisor at Category Design Advisors, where we help founders and CEOs accelerate revenue, improve their ability to fundraise, and increase their valuation in an exit event. And we really just focus on clients who are trying to solve new problems or have radically different approaches to solving old problems. And the challenge that they're trying to get through is either the world doesn't know about them and about what they're doing, or just as frequently, they don't understand why what they're doing matters. So we do that through our business discipline called category design.
And that's what I wanted to start with, John, is, category design is something I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with to some extent, but it's not, I don't think, an everyday term that we use in general, right? And I wanted us to start out just to create a little context. If you could just define category design and maybe give a couple of just examples that people might recognize.
Sure. It's easiest to contrast category design with kind of a traditional approach to business. And I say business and not marketing because category design really is a business strategy that does inform marketing, but it informs other things like the product roadmap, the structure of the company, and other things. But if you've gone to business school or if you've read a lot of the business literature, there's a lens that's often used, and it's around this idea of capturing market share. And that's perfectly acceptable in a lot of contexts, but the world has gotten to a place where that lens doesn't really apply as readily as it should. And the reason that's the case is because there's so many new problems that have cropped up in our world. Like, just think about all the things that have changed. It's just the last few years. All sorts of new problems have arisen. The nature of those problems has changed. The ramifications of solving those problems has increased or been altered along the way. And as these new problems arise, the world needs new types of solutions to solve these problems. Now, this is where um, startup founders get into trouble when they use that typical mindset of trying to capture market share. When you and I think about things that we encounter in the world, our brains, we're encountering that literally thousands of things every day, and we have to save brain power to process all of this. And so when we encounter something new, our brains automatically try to associate it with things that we already understand and have a mental category or bucket around. We don't have the time or the energy to evaluate every new thing on its own merits. And that works really well 99.9% of the time because we're not encountering new things much of the time. But if you're encountering a new idea, a radically different approach, radically different solution that you haven't encountered before, your brain defaults to lumping into something you already know and understand. And that's a real problem because that's not the correct way you should be perceiving that thing. And when startups and founding teams don't be very intentional about educating the world about why a new problem has arisen, why it needs to be solved, and what a new category of solutions, a new type of solution needs to exist, then buyers misunderstand what they do, or they they don't understand it at all. They don't care. They get confused, and it's not just buyers; it's investors, it's people, potential employees, partners. At the end of the day, category design is a process for teaching the market about radically new ideas and radically new solutions that didn't exist or didn't need to exist previously.
And with that context, and thank you for sharing, that was just an amazing description of it, because I think understanding what category design is on a deeper level is so important to what we're going to talk about, right? Because in general, in these conversations about positioning and messaging challenges that companies or marketers overcome, category design is has maybe in some sense, there's an advantage there where you're able to kind of start from scratch, or you're able to invent from the ground up, as opposed to, like, if you're trying to take market share in something that's already existing. But the real challenges you just mentioned is if the buyer, the audience doesn't have a context or a bucket to connect that to or put that in, it makes it very hard to connect your solution to a problem that they can relate to, that they even care about, right? So I appreciate that we could start with that, is that category design is something that goes beyond just how do we position ourselves against the competition, and more about how do we relate what we do to something that the audience that we're going after might not even be having top of mind at this point. Am I kind of close with that assessment?
Yeah, you're really close. And
Mm,
it's helpful to contrast positioning and category design because sometimes they get conflated or interchanged, and they're depending on what definition of positioning you use and who's maybe which author you're reading, that might there might be a lot of overlap or they might be quite different. But I'm going to use a more traditional definition of positioning, which is that in that approach, positioning, it assumes the category and it follows the product. And what I'll talk about in a second is when a category design approach, which is more fundamental, we are defining the category and we are guiding the product. So let me unpack that a little bit. So in a traditional positioning approach, uh, usually where you start is you're looking at an existing space, right? Electric cars, whatever. And you're deciding, okay, within this space, what are we doing differently? Are we serving a different audience? Do we have a unique value proposition? Are there certain features or attributes that are unlike other things in that space? So that's what I mean when I say it kind of assumes the category. We're not really developing new language around a new space or a new idea. And if we do that and we're not actually doing something radically different, that's to our disadvantage. If you're looking for a beer, you want a beer. You don't want something you've never heard of before. Um, the other piece is that positioning, it follows the product. So what I mean by that is when you're going through that exercise, the product scope is largely defined. The product may not exist yet, but that strategy has already been laid out. And your job is to think about how you're going to talk about that in a unique way, in a way that lands and resonates with buyers. So that's why positioning, it's really in the way that I've described it. Others might have a different definition, but in the way I've described it, that's pretty much a marketing approach. It's a marketing discipline. So if you go back to category design, if you recall, we said positioning assumes the category, follows the product. Category design defines the category and guides the product. So if we kind of go back a little bit more fundamental in the business, we're thinking about what problem are we really solving? What, like we talked about earlier in the call, what's changed in the world that now needs to be addressed? And what is our radically different approach to solving that? Well, if that's the question that I'm asking, that's not really a marketing question. That's a CEO, or that's a question that the CEO should be asking with his or her team. Now, when they come up with the right answer to that question, then the product, the solution that they want to build becomes much more self-evident. And it may even get expand in scope. It might get tightened in scope. It might change a little bit in direction based on that answer. But think of it as like kind of the trunk of a tree. You're using that question to guide what you should actually build. And then so that's the product piece. The category piece is now that we're developing this solution, what do we call that? If we don't introduce new language to the world about what this thing is and give buyers the right language and ideas to talk about it and to talk about the problem, then we're not creating a unique space in their minds. They're going to lump our idea when they encounter it into an existing category they have in their brains. And like we talked about earlier, that works against them. So that's how category design defines the category and guides the product itself.
and there's a couple of things I wanted to unpack with you there, because it's interesting too to think of when you mentioned about it being a marketing function in a traditional sense, right? So positioning, and you kind of look at the existing competitive field and where you fit within that, where you can differentiate versus solving a new problem. Just to pull back a little bit, are there situations where it's not necessarily category design in a traditional sense, where you're not creating something fundamentally new,
Mhm.
but where the category design mentality or mindset can be very useful? So I'll give you an example. CRMs, there's a million CRMs, right? And if you look at them from the outside, a lot of the messaging, the core branding messaging is very similar, right? Be more
Mhm.
productive, close more deals, whatever it is, right? And one way, my mind works sometimes when I'm looking at these types of websites is like, well, okay, so if there's 100 of these, what different segment, what different let's call it a sub problem, even though it's kind of a nonsense word, could one of these companies focus on that isn't truly its own category? It's still an existing category, but it's kind of approaching it with that category design mindset. Um, Totally just making this up as we go, but I wanted to throw that out there and see if that's like kind of a legit way to not only look at category design as a whole, but even for people listening, which is probably most of the people listening are working within existing categories, and see how that mindset might even help them.
One of the things that, or one of the ways in which our thinking has evolved since the real blueprint for category design came out, called Play Bigger, is that you can think about this discipline along a spectrum. And so the situations I described to you, where we have totally new problems that demand totally new solutions, that's at one end of the spectrum, Marcus. So that's kind of the highest order of category design and applying this discipline where it's needed most. If you go, let me paint a picture at the far end of the spectrum, and then what you described is somewhere in the middle. But I want to show the ends of the spectrum first because I think that shows the widest view of things. I like to use the example of a plumber. Have you hired a plumber yourself? Like, when's the last time you hired a plumber? Do you remember? Hopefully not
Luckily, I'm
recently.
I'm a renter, and one of the benefits is that
Okay.
I just have to make a phone call. But I've dealt with rental properties of my own a long time ago, and yeah, I've had some plumbing issues to deal with for sure.
Right. Okay. So I picked that example because to me, it's one of the most commoditized spaces that exist. Every town, every city has a bunch of plumbers, and they all basically do the same thing, right? They fix pipes, they fix water problems. So if I'm thinking about first principles with category design, it's how do I occupy unique space in the minds of a buyer? Most plumbers don't do this. It's just, hey, we've got the best service. Look at our ratings. And if you've don't get me wrong, if you have 3,000 Google reviews at 4.9 stars and everyone else has like 100, you have kind of led that category in your town. So you're in a good spot. But for everyone else, let's think about how you might differentiate yourself. Well, there's a number of ways I could do that. I could position myself, or I could design a mental category around being the 24/7 plumber. If you've got a problem at 2:17 in the morning, I'm going to pick up my phone first time you call, and I'm going to show up at your house 10 minutes later. That's a different space in this kind of crowded field of plumbers, right? You could slice and dice this a number of different ways. Maybe I'm the plumber who's always on time, and nobody likes to sit around and wait, 4 hours for somebody to show up. But knowing someone might even pay extra, knowing that if someone's going to come at 2 o'clock, they show up at 2 o'clock, not 3 o'clock, not 1 o'clock, not 5 o'clock, 2 o'clock. You could slice it other ways too. Like maybe you said you've got rental properties. Maybe there's a plumber that deals especially with rental properties and the unique ways that got to deal with you. They've got to deal with the renter. Maybe the types of issues that they encounter are more. Maybe there's some commonalities among rental properties. You would know better than me, but I could go on and on. But the point is, like, there's all sorts of ways that a plumber could occupy a niche within that plumbing category, that plumbing space. So back to your CRM example, that's another great example. If you look at a list of all the CRM platforms out there, yeah, there's probably 100 plus. And if I was in that space, if I'm not like a Salesforce, then what I would be thinking about is what are problems that um, certain audiences or niches within that space still encounter or are now encountering that the leading solution doesn't address sufficiently. So we all know Salesforce is the category king of CRM, but man, how many like dozens of niches like are not adequately served by Salesforce? You and I could probably brainstorm a list of 100 right now.
Just the complexity of using Salesforce by itself it's at least from my perspective, having tried to use it, it can be hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And I haven't done a deep dive in the CRM space, but I'd be willing to bet that the companies that are successful, and by successful, I mean like they're growing, they have healthy profit margins, they have sustainable businesses, they've identified a niche that they can serve better than Salesforce. So they're not creating a brand new category around CRM, um, but they're creating a subcategory within that space. You know, CRM for XYZ buyer, or CRM for XYZ problem, or this and that situation. So, yes, very long answer to your question, but this idea of trying to occupy a unique space in the minds of your buyers, that can be applied all up and down the spectrum of businesses, whether it's something brand new or whether it's a crowded and commoditized space that you want to break free of.
And I wanted to go back to something you mentioned earlier about if it's a true category design, pure kind of like creating from the ground up, how that's not quite so much, at least at the beginning, a marketing function, more of a C-level CEO function.
Mhm.
Like, hey, we're building a company. It's a startup. Like, it's based on this idea, or even the pivot of the startup is based on this fundamentally new approach or solution to a problem. And now what we were just talking about, kind of these kind of like hybrid versions, or they're not quite category design, but you're still thinking of it with that mentality. And the reason I'm bringing it up is I think one of the functional day-to-day challenges that marketers face, and revenue leaders and sales, like that whole
Mhm.
revenue leadership, right, is okay, let's say hypothetically you work for a CRM company, and we're having this conversation, you and me, right? And we're kind of
Yeah.
like, hey, Salesforce, we're never going to beat Salesforce right now because we got 4 people and whatever. And we come up with this positioning strategy informed by your experience with category design of like, hey, we're going to go after this problem. That's where we're going to really own that. And now that has to get bumped upstairs, right? To, back when there was an upstairs, but that has to
Yeah.
get bumped
Right.
onto a Zoom call. I was like on the 34th floor, Um, and that conversation has to be, has to happen with the CEO. And now the part of marketing, the part of revenue leadership, which is to be able to sell ideas, comes in. So can you share a little bit about, I know this is a little bit of a left turn, but like just for somebody who's listening that's thinking like, yeah, I've been really plugging away at this and screaming from the rafters that we need to get more narrow in our focus because we're just generic. But, kind of the tactical kind of tips that you can give to help bring that idea to the C-level, to the CEO, to a founder, and be like, we're going to make this case, right? Because I don't want to oversimplify the perspective of a CEO or a founder, but from practical experience, it seems to err more on the side of let's not limit our options than to limit our options. And I know that's not across the board, so I don't want to make it seem like it's everybody. But it's again, kind of a long-winded question, but I want to throw that out there and see if you had any thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. I've met so many marketers who've tried to do what you just described, and I've been one of them myself. And chances of success of making a fundamental shift in the company direction is ultimately it's pretty low. And I say that because not that marketers are doing anything wrong. It's just that if you're hired to be a marketer, you're hired to be a marketer, and you can inform strategy, but you're not going to dictate strategy. And as much as I've even met marketers who have had like really solid ideas and been right on with their assessment of the situation and how that the business either needed to pivot or niche down and really have focus. And they've told me like they're just ignored by the CEO. And this is not like a junior level marketer. This is a VP marketing level. And then they've had that same CEO hire a consultant to come in, gave them the exact same answer, and then they were comfortable with taking that leap. And I think it goes back to that adage of, profits not welcome in their hometown. It's just that you sometimes, and I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know why this is the case, but I think there's a certain level of courage you need to make those changes. And hearing it from the outside, from the inside comes with too much baggage. Hearing it from the outside sometimes gives you that certainty that this is an objective opinion. This is someone who's seen this pattern multiple times and has a more dispassionate view of my business and therefore that I can place more faith in that situation. So that being said, I'm not saying marketers can't affect that change, but if they were going down that path, the advice that I would give is to connect it to revenue. And because let's play devil's advocate for the CEO. If you're the CEO and your marketing team is coming to you, you're probably going to ask questions like, well, maybe that's the problem, but maybe the problem is something with your channel strategy. Maybe you're not using the right tactics, or maybe your team's not creative enough, or maybe you've got the wrong people on your team, or maybe you're not the right CMO to get the job done, which is a real thing that happens, right?
18-month tenure, right?
18-month tenure. That's right. So, I would say like work with the CEO on like no one likes to be just flat out told what the answer is. People like to discover answers for themselves. So instead of trying to like present this case and convince the CEO to make this change, think about it differently. How can you partner with the CEO to assess the situation and be like work on those answers together and tie it all to revenue, tie it all to like, how is this lack of direction, this lack of messaging, lack of a category strategy preventing us from generating the revenue we need, and start from there. And maybe you do need an outside perspective to kind of mediate the process and give you that objective opinion. But if you're going to do it internally, approach things as an ally, not someone you need to kind of convince and win over, because I don't see that being very effective. I've never really heard of that working well.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, if an outside consultant were to come in, and again, we're just talking in generalities, right? What's
Yeah.
not every time. And one of the things about, convincing somebody of something, it's like back to what selling really is about. And it's a little bit of a tangent left turn I'm going to take here, but I think it's important for this because we could talk about strategy and positioning and all these things. And you can have a brilliant idea, but if you can't get buy-in from people, it won't matter, right? And I think kind of taking a step back and kind of defining what selling really is internally as well as externally. So, a consultant, you're a consultant, right? That's what you do. And so you go in there and I'm going to guess you don't go in and just start trying to convince the CEO of a company that they should do this and they should do that. You're actually in that kind of partnership. And I'm taking a wild guess with that, but I'm just going to assume it. In that consultative, let's call that consultative selling approach, right? It's probably dated, but it's like you're having that conversation, you're presenting new options, you're letting them see things that they might not have been aware of, right? You're expanding their scope of perspective and reframing the problem. And I think that's what the best salespeople do, right? The best salespeople external, like just the traditional SaaS sales, right? They're not going in there hammering somebody about how they're wrong and how if they don't do it this way, they're stupid, right?
Right.
I mean, there's some people that do that, but I don't think they're very successful. It's really about understanding their perspective, having that conversation, having that discovery, right? And the difference internally is, you're already aware of a lot of things maybe, but maybe the things we're assuming, right? We think we understand the CEO or the founder and where they're coming from, but there's still that need to have that quote discovery conversation, find out what their perspective is. And I just want to, I know it's a little bit off topic, but I wanted to kind of like throw that out there and see if you had anything to add, because I think, again, the tactical, the functional day-to-day of this is, even with the best ideas, you have to figure out how to, whether we call it selling or persuasion or influence doesn't really matter, right?
Mhm.
It's about moving good ideas forward and with other people involved, you know?
And I think it's the kind of problem that hopefully you can try to assess and avoid before you even join the team. If you're, if you're coming in as an individual contributor, your ability to assess the CEO's relationship with marketing is somewhat limited, but it's something you should explore as part of your interview process. So you're joining a team where marketing is seen as a strategic ally, not a cost center. And if you're coming in as a VP marketing or CMO, if and I've made this mistake, like if you don't do a good job of assessing what marketing's role is going to be and if it has a role in those strategic discussions, and will your CEO seek out your advice and your perspective on those things, then failing to do that up front and then trying to do that after the fact, you might have joined the wrong company, or you might have had, the wrong CEO in place that's, you're just not compatible with the way you see each other's roles. What's What's been your experience? I mean, you've worked with a lot of teams on messaging. Have you run into situations where messaging couldn't get adopted, or the team wasn't bought into a different approach to messaging, or couldn't put it into practice? What challenges have you seen?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I just did want to mention, keeping with the selling analogy, like what you just mentioned about having that conversation before taking the job, that's like, we could just call that qualifying, right?
Mhm.
Qualifying the prospect. It's all the same thing. Like, just, hey, am I going to actually be able to come in here and solve this problem? Because ultimately, whether, if I'm acting as a copywriter or freelancer or a consultant, it doesn't really matter. I'm there to solve a problem, not just write words on a in a computer,
Yeah.
But yeah, to your question, I think that in my experience, the challenge that you just mentioned about, like, there's a mindset, whether that could be based on growth, kind of metrics that they need to hit. One thing that I wasn't aware of a few years ago was how much the funding rounds and how much hitting seats and chairs kind of matters, as far as, like, I'll be like, why they keep hiring SDRs if they're not, well, it's because we just got to show growth, right? Yeah, I
Mhm.
still come from, like, but yes, but you have to make money. But that's just me being naive, I guess, sometimes. Like, the other thing that I've seen happen as a copywriter is the frenetic pace of content creation. And in this case, I mean, content could be, traditional messaging projects like your campaigns, your email, you're redoing a website, or it could just be what we think of as, blog posts or webinars, whatever it is. It's become kind of like a lot about, how do we just get more of this out the door as quickly as possible? Because the, you know, MQL model of, we're going to demonstrate our value by showing that we can send a lot of qualified leads to sales. And there's a lot of argument about what qualified and what quality might mean. That's the metric. If that's the metric, then it's just about, let's do another blog post, or let's do another white paper. Let's do and it becomes so much about pushing out content as quickly as possible. And taking the time to actually pause, have a conversation, not have to come up with the answer in that conversation, right? It's not like, let's have a meeting on Zoom and at the end of the Zoom call, we'll make a decision. Okay.
Yeah.
Or they make the decision once a year, at the end of the year for the next. And it's kind of like, here's how it should go, versus, you're not going to know how the outcomes are going to be, versus kind of like more of a experimental mentality of, okay, we have an hypothesis. We
Mhm.
think that this positioning strategy is going to work. We think that this messaging strategy and this type of copy and this headline, whatever it is going to work, but we don't know. Let's give ourselves the latitude to be able to find out what works and what doesn't, and then adjust. And that requires taking a beat, having a conversation, assessing it, and not it just being about how many blog posts did we put out? Are we posting on LinkedIn every day? Like that to me on a functional, like in kind of the trenches viewpoint is what I see.
Yeah. And a lot of what you described is focus on quantitative, focus on volume. A lot of times teams don't even assess what they want content to accomplish. And I don't mean like, well, of course we want it to drive revenue. That's a given, but that's something more fundamental. Like we want buyers to understand that, well, I'm going to put on my category design hat, but we want buyers to understand that there's a problem they're experiencing that they didn't know about. Could be one example. Okay. And if that's your guiding principle, it's much more easy to think about what kind of content would affect that kind of mental shift. And then you don't get hung up on, well, how many views did we get on the blog, or what's the conversion rate to request a demo. Sometimes content can serve that purpose, but sometimes the content is just changing the way people's perception or creating a new perception about something. And that can be very powerful. And often it needs to happen before you can get to those other kind of tactical um, actions like talking to sales or becoming a lead. But until you go through that process of really breaking down first principles of what you need content or any other effort to really achieve, you're back to what you described. You're just doing activity for activity's sake and kind of making a show about growing or being busy, but not really addressing what the business needs from a strategic perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when you've got something dialed in, we'll go back to Salesforce, and I'm just kind of making this up. But if you're Salesforce, you know, and you've got it dialed in, probably, right? So at this point, when you're thinking about how many posts are we put out, like there's, I imagine, such a sophisticated, effective system behind closed doors of Salesforce that they can think about those metrics because they figure it out. At least up to date, they figured out what's working, what's not. Now that could change in 6 months. That could change in 3 months. I'm sure their business changed fundamentally in beginning of 2020, like most of our businesses did, right? So it doesn't mean there's not still a mode of experimentation. But most companies are not Salesforce, right? Most companies are not HubSpot. They're not. And so they're going in, if you're going in as a new category, like from your perspective with category design, and you're trying to go in and quantify thing by MQL metrics before you've even defined how to bridge the gap between people's understanding of their problems and how your new solution that might not fit exactly into one of their buckets helps them, then that at that point, you know, the metrics of MQLs or blog reads or how many people are following on LinkedIn is almost like a moot point, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And you mentioned Salesforce, and there's one other point I want to hit on it, which is the way that they've um, created their messaging and the mindset that they're trying to affect has changed over time. They have one of the like most often kind of trotted out examples of selling the problem when they did a mock protest back in the, I think this was like 99 or the maybe early 2000s. Um, their biggest competitor at this time was this company called Siebel Systems, which had an on-premise CRM. And when people thought of the word software, that's what they meant, or that's what it meant in their minds. So keep in mind, this is 20 years ago, and this is before software as a service. People bought things on CD-ROMs or on premise servers. So they did this mock protest at Siebel Systems user group, and they hired people to hold up these signs that said it had software with a big red line crossed through it. So like no software. It was this anti-software protest. And they even like had reporters come in and cover this protest and all that. And the idea they were trying to convey at the time was there's a problem with software. This idea of on premise is very expensive. It's very cumbersome. Most businesses don't have 6, 7 figures to deploy something like that. And so it got people thinking about why a different approach to software might be necessary. And so they had the category they built wasn't CRM. The category they built was SaaS, or they called it cloud software as well. And it happened to be a CRM product. But the idea that you could buy software over the internet through a recurring monthly fee was foreign to people. And when Salesforce went public, the analysts didn't even understand how to value the company, because this idea of paying $25 a month into perpetuity didn't make sense to them. They understood like a $10 million contract, but not selling 10 million people $25 a month. That's how foreign this idea was. And that's all they did for a long time, was sell this idea of cloud software. Now they don't do that anymore, right? There's still some businesses that are moving into cloud, or increasing the proportion of their technology that's on the cloud, but they don't need to sell like why cloud or why SaaS exists. So, and again, I'm not claiming that Salesforce has it all figured out or that they're doing everything right, but I used to get like the physical Wall Street Journal delivered to my house, and for just a couple years ago, even they were running these like full page ads, and it had a chart of market share with like Salesforce, Microsoft, Oracle, and one or two others in there. And the whole idea was just Salesforce is the number one CRM. And it just had a graph showing how their market share has risen over time. And that's all it was. It was just, we're number one, we're number one, we're number one, trying to reinforce that position and create some, I think, probably some safety in the minds of potential buyers that this was still the go-to choice. And you can't really go wrong choosing CRM. It's what everyone else is choosing. Now, their job now isn't to think about how do we build the cloud software. It's about redesigning or continuing to design what's possible with cloud. And you see them integrating other types of business functions and other cloud platforms into Salesforce, of which CRM is one piece, but it's a part of a larger suite of things. And I don't really understand their category strategy fully, but I've got inklings that it's something beyond just a pure CRM, and it has been for quite some time.
And I wanted to ask, and I apologize if this is a dumb question, but when you went back to the 99, 2000, when Salesforce kind of created this event, or this, they reframed this problem, right? And it wasn't about we're not creating the category of CRM. If I remember at the time, it was mostly like I used ACT a lot back then, so they existed, right? But it was like around basically a recurring revenue model, right? Or the cloud or whatever.
Right.
Would that be something you would define as category design, even if their category was, or even if they were doing something in CRM, but they were creating a new category based on kind of like they were approaching it from the side angle? Would be that would fit into that model for you as far as that's category design?
Absolutely. There's a problem with the traditional approach to software that came to a head because businesses couldn't afford to have a real CRM because they didn't have the budget and the time to do something like that. So small businesses is where they started. So small businesses, back to your niche strategy, they didn't have access to a tool like this. So there was a new problem that arose because of the way technology had developed. And the solution to that problem was not a better type of on-premise solution. It was a totally different type of solution called SaaS or cloud software.
And as a when I put on my copywriter hat and I think about that kind of story, and if the thing it makes me think of first is, when we go to the messaging side of things and we think about, okay, now how do we present ourselves in a way that's different? If fundamentally your positioning is just like everybody else, right? And you're relying on, how do we say this in a more clever way? How can we be really creative? Like creativity is great. Be creative. But at the same time, if you're fundamentally the same exact thing as everybody else, but you're a little bit more clever, or maybe you're like really sassy, right? Whatever it is, like, that's fine. That's maybe a way to position yourself for sure, right? It's like the personality of the brand. But when I think back to that example of Salesforce back at the new millennium, I think about like, not that the messaging would take care of itself, right? But to some degree, I imagine it kind of did, right? Like they knew we're going to present this problem. We're going to frame this problem of why would you want to spend $10 million to put servers on premises and have all this cost up front when you can just pay this, blah, 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 blah. The messaging, the actual, like the sitting down at the computer and coming up with ways specifically to express that is still a whole nother thing, but way easier to do, right? Than if we went back in our time machine and we're now in 2020 in Salesforce office and they're just going, we just got to make it seem like we're just better as a CRM, right?
I think looking back, it sounds easy, but you have to remember that like that idea of entering your credit card, uh, forget about recurring software. The idea of buying anything over the internet was crazy. It was weird, and it wasn't. And some of those concerns were valid. Like we didn't have the security processes we have today. It was just a totally foreign concept, and this we're so used to SaaS now, but at that time that was just crazy. That was crazy that you would do that and you would buy software that way. It was like just go to Circuit City and buy the CD-ROM and put the damn thing in your computer and be done with it. Like, so it wasn't just like the high level idea. Then it's like you've got to work people through like, how are you going to use this? What are they get the high level idea, but then there's like objections or concerns or questions or how does it work? So you can't stop just at high level and assume people will get it. You have to break that down and kind of meet them where they are and work with them forward. And I think this is going to come up in the next few years with AI. There's we just hit this inflection point where consumers like you and me, unless you have a side gig as an AI developer, which I'm guessing you don't, you and I didn't really have a way to interact with AI until just very recently with ChatGPT. And so the the series of events we foresee happening is there's this first part is not revolutionary. You'll hear this everywhere. There's going to be all sorts of AI driven products, and there already are. That's a given. Like everyone's already talking about that. But what I think's what's going to happen, Marcus, is people will assume that because I tell you that my thing is enabled with AI, that's enough for you to think, oh, well, this is better. I need to try that. And we think about all the ways in which we're still uncomfortable with AI. Think about all the shortcomings and that it still has. Chat GPT can give you misleading or incorrect information. We still don't know how to like interact with it and provide it with the right prompts. There's all sorts of unknowns and things that have yet to be figured out. So me just telling you that I have a product and it's different, it's only differentiation, it's that it has AI, that's not really enough to shift enough buyers. It'll get some, the early adopters, but for the early majority, um, it's not going to move the needle. We have to go back. Like, what problem is AI solving for us? Has this problem not been solved before? Why did this problem not exist earlier? And frame it in this context of what is this allowing us to do that we couldn't before? And it can't just be, oh, well, it's AI, so it's cool and it's faster, because then you're just repeating what happened in the late 90s with, oh, it's on the internet, therefore it must be better or worth doing. And in many cases, it didn't work or the business model didn't work. And you had, how many companies went bust during that cycle because um, that design, that the practice of using websites and building websites hadn't really been established, and people didn't know what was what until several years later.
I love that you brought up that example or that point about now in hindsight, how easy it was for me to just, not that I thought that the messaging for Salesforce in 2000 would be easy, but like
Mhm.
comparatively, right? But like at the time, like I didn't even think about that at the time. Yeah, I remember people like, I'm not putting my credit card out there, right? And like losing sight of that, right?
Mhm.
And then the AI example I think is so perfect because that's what I'm seeing everywhere. Like, and by everywhere I mean mostly LinkedIn, but whenever you see stuff about AI, it's like whiz bang, awesome, look at what it could do. And
Mhm.
it's like, okay, when it comes time down to it, like all these questions that I would have, like, is it going to lie to me? Is it going to tell me that it wants to take over my
Mhm.
household? Whatever it is, whatever we're reading about. Right. And, and I think it brings up a really important point about one, think about what messaging is more than just benefits. Messaging is, even if it's straight up like within something, a category people are already used to, but especially if it's either pure category design on that far end of the spectrum or of some version of it where you're kind of niching down and creating a different approach, that it's not just about why it's awesome. It's also about what is stopping them from moving forward. So addressing that somehow in the messaging, and that there's a million ways to do that, but also really, this is a good reminder for me in this conversation, is as much as we think we understand the buyer and we think it's so cool, look at this thing, it's so cool, right? That, our job as marketers is to go way beyond what we think the buyer or the audience is
Mhm.
interested in and understanding, because they might say, oh no, I'm not touching that. Well, why not? And now we start to get really into where we have to address it.
There used to be a disease that would cripple children and cause paralysis and all sorts of terrible ailments, and it was affected kids for years and years, and it was called polio. And like 100 something years ago, there was a vaccine. I don't know the exact date, but decades ago anyway, there's a vaccine. I give your child this shot, they won't suffer a life crippling illness. They won't be paralyzed. Like you think the stuff we sell in SaaS is important. That's like it's totally next level. Okay. Your child won't die.
Making the world a better place, but really.
Right. So that's about as good of a product benefit as you can get. Okay. And polio was eradicated until people started questioning whether it was necessary or were the side effects of the vaccine, and kids started getting polio again. It's terrible, but that's exactly what happened. To your point, Marcus, like the benefit was there. That's not you can't question that. But there was some gap between the concerns these people had and information or probably misinformation that they got, and that gap wasn't closed between whoever's marketing polio vaccines and or educating the public on polio vaccines, probably a better term than marketing, and what the perception of these buyers was, or parents, consumers. So yeah, if the product doesn't sell itself, people always have questions, concerns, um, reasons not to buy, even for the best and most effective products. And if that's the case for a polio vaccine, then it's absolutely going to be the case for a piece of software we're buying.
Or even if there's nothing blatantly kind of questionable or they're concerned about, it's just change in general, right?
Yeah,
Changing
change
anything.
in general.
Like, it's easier just to do nothing unless you absolutely have to. Um, well, I wanted to give you a chance as we wrap up, you know, as a category designer, from that perspective, for people that are listening that are kind of on that further side of the scale. Maybe they're really creating what they think is a brand new category, right? Um, or even if it's kind of closer to that, but it doesn't even have to be something that's really fundamentally ground shifting.
Mhm.
And they're looking at it and saying, okay, I'm in a lead marketing role in this smaller, let's say it's a smallish company, it's a startup. And I need to figure out how to be able to like have a good starting point. I need to take the CEO or the founder's vision, and I need to be able to translate that into an actionable plan, right? What would you suggest, like, the first one or two steps would be? I know that's a really open-ended question, but I just want to kind of get an assessment of where they might start.
I think I would start with the question of, do you have a unique space in the minds of your buyers today? If so, what is that? And is that the right one? And if you're still getting yeses, then double down on what you're doing. If you have a unique spot and it's wrong, or you're you're perceived as a commodity, then the question you've got to ask next is, what do I need to do to close that gap? And I think if you start with that question, then that's going to inform like, what level of education, what type of mindset shift you need to make among your buyers. Until you make that, everything else that's tactical won't really be as effective as it could. You can't kind of rush to ask someone to buy if they don't understand why you're different and what problem that you're solving for them. And um, so starting with those questions gives you the good foundation. So I'd begin there.